what we thought we'd do is maybe take you a little bit of the background of what we intended to do at the start, what we ended up doing a couple of years ago, and then what we're doing today. And this started with a conversation with a lot of us, plus Dwayne and Retsiv. And what we were seeing was in the use of AI in manufacturing operations, there were three things going on. One was while we were all working on point solutions on different topics, it wasn't quite clear what the broader picture would turn out to be, okay? And so there was incredible insight in terms of the specific examples, but trying to fast forward the clock was a bit of a mystery and say, what's some of these scenarios? The second thing is, for reasons that we didn't really fully understand, some firms seem to be pulling away from the rest, okay? And that were leaders in it and started to see impact from machine intelligence described broadly. And we were trying to figure out what was actually making this happen and what were the factors that would cause that. The third one is the sense that, if this problem was solved or there was a way to address this, the results would be quite impactful and would be big and would have quite a bit of impact on the industry overall or the economy. And so we tried to put all of this together and say, what could we do about it? And in typical fashion, what we did was we said, let's launch a project around this and a study. And literally, we went out about 100 companies, and this was a recap of what we did in 2021. We'll dig a little bit in terms of what the results on that were. But we went out to about 100 companies and literally looked at 9 categories of topics, 17 different use cases, 17 business outcomes, ranging from financial outcomes to performance to speed, and then measured 21 KPIs. And the irony is, for a work on machine intelligence and AI, this is probably the most manual piece of work that any of us had done over hundreds and hundreds of hours to try to understand what was going on. But the numbers don't really tell the full story, and it just tells a fraction of it. And so what we did was we coupled that with a qualitative study of what specific companies were doing. Brian's going to talk through the Vista example. We'll cover it briefly. And a lot of this was written up, and obviously we can make it available again. But trying to tease out these examples of what different firms were doing, and not simply around what the models were, but what the end-to-end system was, including people, including deployment, including budgets, and what might that be in terms of creating a playbook for what companies might do. And so we looked through many of these examples. Magna International, for instance, is an auto parts supplier, and a major one in Canada. And they produce clutches. And at the end of the process, for them, they'd reduce the waste in the manufacturing process by 80%. And so you start to pull these examples together and say, look, there could be a big benefit here of getting this right. And so I won't talk through these examples. Again, I think we'll cover them briefly. Bruce mentioned analog devices before. And in terms of impact, I think Dwayne's point about the undergrads taking machine intelligence or AI as a course, we started to see across industries as well. McDonald's, for instance, trains a lot of their frontline managers around tools to use AI for forecasting and production, right? And that's basically a broad application. So this notion about how do you take it to the front line started to come about. So as we dug through the numbers, the first thing is, we were looking for this. So we saw leaders. And we saw a category that were emerging companies, and we call emerging companies across the board. And there were 3 factors we looked at, right? So one is, let's look at the results that people were obtaining broadly, right? What was the breadth of their impact, not simply the level of the impact. So the results. The second thing was, what was the deployment? How much effort did they put into this? How many years were they at it? What were their budgets? And that was a measure, several measures of deployment. And then the last one was enablers, right? There's a set of enablers here, both people, systems, data, and to what degree those enablers put things in place so that people could get some of the impact here. So we expected to find leaders and emerging. The two surprises when we clustered the analysis were what we call planners and executors. And there were a set of companies that were basically putting a ton of infrastructure in place, but were hoping to see the hockey stick at some point, okay? And would probably do that. But clearly, it's a philosophy that they'd had to say, look, to do anything, we need to put a lot of data in place, a lot of systems in place, and so on and so forth. And we call those planners. And clearly, that's got a lot of merit, and that fits into those cultures of those companies. There's a second set of companies that we called executors, which are basically saying, look, I'm not going to worry about the end result. I'm going to take what I can get, right? And they would pick 2 or 3 or 4 use cases and really ram them home, right? So then expand those across these companies and worry about the infrastructural impact later on. And the goal would be both of these would end up hopefully in the same place. And that's where we focused a lot of our effort. What do the leaders do versus the emerging companies? And as a second order benefit, what do the planners and the executors do to basically get to the same outcome? So let's cover quickly about what the leaders do, and then Brian will take you through some of the use cases around here. So one is the seriousness with which leaders took machine intelligence. It wasn't a hobby. It wasn't a set of data scientists that they'd hired. It was basically a very senior level of focus, and we saw this in the governance processes that they had put in place, right? There was a pharmaceutical firm that at the top level would basically go through the use cases, figure out the deployment stats, figure out the amount of budget, and do that on a regular basis. So clearly, and then they were highly aware that the talent, even despite the 1,000 students, is still kind of scarce. And so there was this effort to have centralized or specialized centers of excellence to try and deploy this more broadly. We'd expect that over time to diffuse into companies, but clearly this notion of having a center of excellence to try and guide some of these efforts was important. And the governance within which those resources were used was equally important. So that was one thing that was done. The second thing was we found that the leaders, to a shocking amount, used MI much more widely across the company. So 3 use cases were used across the board, across every single leader that we found. One was forecasting. The second was maintenance optimization. And the third one was around supply chain, right? And so in addition to those 3, most leaders would have something like 14 out of the 17 use cases in process or deployed somewhere. Third one was a broad ecosystem of partners. And there was one CTO who said, look, the difference about manufacturing is every line is unique, right? So it's not like an ERP system where you replicate the same process over and over again at multiple firms. In some sense, these are all unicorns. And so because of that, it's very hard for any particular company to have the scale to solve each one from a first principles basis. And so they would leverage a range of partners, whether it's academia or startups or consulting firms or vendors. And we found, ironically, that leaders were the most reliant on outside parties than companies who were not leaders and emerging. And then the last thing, whoops. Okay. Well, the last one was around the front line. I mentioned McDonald's with the training, but this notion of pushing data and pushing capabilities down to the front line. Versus in some companies, you found that people are parochial about the data and don't share it more broadly. Leaders, in contrast, were not protective about data and would actually tend to share it across the board. And we find this across multiple industries as well. So at this point, let me turn it over to Brian, who can talk through some of the results in 2021. 2023 is actually turning out to be even more interesting, and we'll cover that later.
Great. Thanks, Vijay. Good morning, everyone. So really excited to be here to talk about the findings. And what you can see here is ultimately the insights that came out of the work in 2021. And so when we surveyed the impact that these leaders were having and the rest of the group was having, it really emerged around these 21 different dimensions of performance. And there were a couple big insights. One is not surprisingly to anyone in this room that regardless of whether you're a leader or new to the journey, that there's meaningful performance elevation that can come out of your investments in machine intelligence and digital and analytics. The second one was that leaders were generating substantially greater returns. In 2021, that was around 2.7 times what those that were newer on their journey or sort of in the bottom 50% were realizing. So there was real benefit in being a leader and making these investments. When we look at those 21 dimensions, there were also a couple of use cases that really came out and showed that they were having a disproportionate impact. When we look at factory efficiency overall, we saw that condition-based monitoring, predictive maintenance, and digital twins were enabling greater degrees of throughput, improved yield performance, and efficiency that were really translated into better outputs in manufacturing operations. On the cost side, One of the big emerging themes was around inventory optimization, using supply chain visibility, advanced intelligence, and coupling and forecasting, better forecast accuracy to really make sure that the inventory was being used more efficiently, and we had the right inventory available at the right time in the right location to allow the factories to run effectively. Again, Vijay pointed out, what we saw also was that demand accuracy or forecast accuracy was an application that really was moving the needle. Here, what the leaders were doing were coupling internal data sets with external data sets and really using those to build algorithms that allowed them to better predict what the market was going to need and when, so that they could be better positioned to make their plans in their factories to service that demand. And then when you couple those all together on the responsiveness and customer experience side, those had uplifts, meaningful uplifts in lead time as well as in service level that directly benefited their customers. And the final point I'll make is really around the environmental side of things. And I think this is one of the more exciting stories that came out of this research. So when we look at process optimization, whether it's advanced process controls or just general algorithms, there was a great example coming out of Vistra where they built an algorithm that helped them understand the condition of all of their assets, the condition, their operating conditions, as well as the ambient operating environment that they were in. Use that to update and align their operation strategy twice an hour that allowed them to better match their current, their planning and operating parameters at that point. And in doing so, we're able to reduce their fuel consumption by 1% across their network, which is very, very significant. And at the end of the day, with that plus their reliability improvements that they generated, we're able to offset the equivalent of one full power plant across their network. So a case here where not only are we seeing financial benefits, but also significant environmental benefits as well. Agree with that one. There we go. All right. So that was 2021, and how has that changed over the last 2 years? And we're still pretty early in the analysis of the results, but what we're seeing is that the leaders are pulling away. So whereas in 2021, leaders were generating about 2.7 times the returns, in 2023, you see that that's up to 3.8% or 3.8x. And we have some hypotheses here. The big one being that we believe that leaders are likely moving into the point where they're now starting to scale. And so as an example, there's an automotive client that invested in early stages of plant reliability in 2021. And so then they found an application for predictive maintenance, condition-based monitoring in their paint shops. And that pilot generated great results. They started to scale it across their network. They installed it into all of their paint shops, and now the next generation here is then taking those learnings and scaling from there into their body shops, uplifting overall plant reliability. And you can imagine there that you start to see a compounding benefit of those investments and a higher ROI. So we expect that those are the types of things that are starting to take hold in the leaders. Now, what can we all learn from this? There's really 5 things that have emerged. And I'll run through these relatively quickly. But the first one is get the flywheel spinning. And so here what we're saying is find opportunities with short payback cycles where your team can be focused, where there's organizational pull, and you can make a difference to build momentum and understand the applications and what it takes to really realize the benefit of MI in your unique operating environment. We also saw that leaders are not overly proud. They don't suffer from not invented here syndrome. They're willing to look across industry, understand what others are doing, what are the applications that make sense for them, and they're building a coalition internally, generally at a very senior level, to say this is something that we want to invest in. This is what it's going to take, and then aligning on where they're going to go and drive value through this. They're building partnerships and ecosystems, and here. What we really mean is that they are looking across the available, across the whole landscape. They're looking at startups, they're looking at incumbents, and they're understanding what are the best applications that they can bring to their unique context, not looking for a sort of a generic platform that they can work from across the board, but really where are the best use cases, and then finding ways to integrate them into a single thread. And so that's through startups, that's through incumbents, that's through academia, and running the risk of sounding self-serving. That also involves consultants here and there as well. And then the fourth thing is around investing in people. As Vijay said, talent is scarce. It's going to probably become even more scarce. The leaders are creating centers of excellence. They're investing in building out those teams, but also investing in building the capabilities of their broader team to supplement that. And they're also thinking about what it takes to really use the insights they're generating to translate that into meaningful performance improvement. And so just as important as it is to build the analytics and the analytics capabilities, it's equally important to build the change management capabilities that will allow you to make the operational changes a reality and to really leverage the insights that your intelligence is driving. And the last thing is they're investing in data. So here, what we'd really say is they're looking at curating all of the right data internally. They're looking at what is the right data externally, whether that's in their supply chain or in the macro environment, and then bringing those sources together to provide the best possible insights. So my last point here really is around, so what does this take and what can you expect? What we see is that the leaders are continuing to invest. On a percentage basis, leaders are investing 50 to 60% more than those that are not in the leadership capacity. They're also accelerating their investment by about 20%, whereas those that are falling behind are maintaining their investments or shrinking them more significantly. And then on the right-hand side, you can also see what you can expect in terms of path to impact. And so what you really see is that most of these leaders are really, have actually only been on this journey for 1 to 2 to 2 to 4 years. And so by getting the flywheel started, they're starting to see those benefits and really emerging. Now I'll turn it over to Bruce.
All right. Thank you very much. My live? Yep, sounds like it. Great. So one of the important aspects of this when we started this study was to help people move from where they were to where they desired to go. And so we gave kind of that situational awareness, and that's why you heard Vijay talk about planners, executors, leaders, and emerging, so that you could see where you are and then see where you wanted to go next. And so that's how we structured the study. And it was also very important to have students involved. So we've always had students helping collect the data, do the research, and Ryan Kochert and Haley Harara did a phenomenal job this year. Unfortunately, one thing we didn't optimize for is almost all of them have the same class right now. So they are not here, but they will be here. So they can't hear their shout out, but they've just done a phenomenal job of crunching the numbers this year. So this is, once again, a very much student-led initiative. We are kind of midstream, so we're giving kind of high-level readouts. So what I mean by that is we've completed the quantitative piece, and then we will kick off the qualitative piece. And for the qualitative piece, we'll be actually working with the Industrial Performance Center and structuring our interviews with different companies so that we have a very clear case record of how people are using machine learning, and some of the examples from last year, or the last study, we'll be able to have more of those, but in a structured fashion. And what we get from the quantitative research is, where are the outliers? Where do we want to go dig? What are the questions that we want to ask? And so as I go through my piece of this, you'll see, it's like, I wonder why that is, or why is that? And we don't want to make any leap of causality. It just raises good questions for us to dig into of why these things are true. So this is one of my least favorite slides, and I'll tell you why in a second. I'm going to stand up here. So so what we're showing now is partnering, and certainly partnering is very important to do, And these are the types of people that we're partnering with: academia, startups, consulting firms, vendors, and other industry partners. And so as you read this chart, leaders on the right-hand side, so if you got a triangle on the right or a blue box more to the right, that's more of it. And if it's on the left, it's less of it, right? So what you saw in 2021 is leaders were using a lot of academia and a lot of startups. And in 2023, they used less so. So that's why it's not my favorite slide. But it's still very important and kind of interesting. The bottom 50% stayed roughly the same. Similarly, with startups, they moved back, and early on they were willing to take risks. So there's a lot of reasons that could underlie that. The existing vendors have now caught up, so the people that are buying their core infrastructure have built machine learning into their core products. Building up their internal capabilities more. These centers of excellence starting to push their solutions out, right, as we see them moving through another couple of years older in their scale. So once again, these are the things we will explore. But still very robust right in here of continuing to partner. And that's important, and you saw that mostly with the executors, or more so with the executors. So as Vijay said, they picked a problem that was absolutely critical to their business. They made sure they had the data for it, and they partnered to get something done quickly. So they got that fast ROI kick out of it. On this chart, I think this is really representative of a change that we've seen in the last few years. It's a lot of data because it's MIT, sorry. But this is who owns the machine learning agenda at what level. So CEO and board, CXO, kind of the VP level, and then at a director level. And what you see is in 21, it was mostly kind of VP level. So it's kind of an operational thing. We're going to improve some internal process.
Can you hear me?
In 2023, and this data was actually collected before ChatGPT, it had moved up. So basically, this whole segment here moved up to the CEO and board level agenda. And we'll be certainly exploring that a lot more and the implications of that. But I think that's going to make a huge difference. But it will be the leaders that are going to pull ahead even further. So we've seen they're outperforming, they're out investing, and if you look at where it sits on the agenda, it's much higher. So 2 years ago, we predicted the leaders would have a bigger gap, and they have. And based on this data, I think you're going to see that happen again. Okay, so this is a gap analysis. As I mentioned when we started this study, it's like, why are people having so much problems? And once again, this is a negative slide, so if you're farther to the right, it means you're having more trouble. And if you're farther to the left, it means you're having less trouble. So the interesting things are here when things flip or move broadly. So in 2021, I think everybody said they had a lack of expertise, but now you see the leaders are not complaining of that as much. So they are able to attract and find the people that they need more so. It's not that they don't still have their challenges, but it's still a really big issue. It's very far to the right here for the bottom 50%. Once again, indicating more that the leaders will continue to pull ahead. Interestingly enough, leaders thought culture was an issue. In 2021, it seems to be far less so. It's dropped way back. So I think people have gotten the message, if you will, that this needs to be part of the culture. Data availability. This was kind of an interesting one. This is one we're going to I think, lean into a little bit more to understand. Their leaders are complaining more about lack of data availability. And what we think it is, when coupled with uncertain ROI, but we will explore it, is that they're driving to new use cases where they have less data, they have less certainty, and so that is kind of driving that. We will see. Then everybody doesn't have enough time. And we think this closing of the gap here, because you see in 2021, there was a big separation. Now everyone kind of thinks of it the same way. Is that a recession thing, a pandemic thing? I don't know. We may be able to get a little bit out of that. And one thing we didn't mention is if you do want to see the 21 results, it was written up in Harvard Business Review. There's a great article on McKinsey.com. All of them are accessible through the MIMO website, so be sure to check that out. The payback periods have shortened, so that can mean a couple of things. But essentially, well, okay, so sorry. We think it means there's kind of a fundamental risk averseness and in some people, so they want a quicker payback, so they're choosing smaller projects. But on the other hand, you could say leaders are getting a faster payback because of their higher KPI performance. And so once again, this is because it's a numerator and denominator type of equation. We're going to have to dig into that a little bit more. But we certainly are seeing that less investment is required as we get more and more mature software solutions out there. So I will hand it back to Brian for a little summary here.
So trying to bring it all together. So what can we take away from all of this? There's really four things. One, we think coming at this from a value-backed perspective is the right way to start. What is the part of your business that you want to transform? What is the vision of where you're trying to get to? And then how do analytics, machine intelligence, and of course change management really contribute to that level of performance? We should be thinking about what the full magnitude of change that's required there. So how do we operationalize these things and these insights? And how do we need to realign the organization? The third point here is really around building those change management muscles. And then the fourth thing is how do you get the flywheel spinning again? So where are the quick wins? Where's their organizational value? And then how can you create pulls so that you can create opportunities to scale quickly? 2 seconds.
So this is the commercial piece here. So we create a playbook for this. And this is a customized playbook. As I mentioned, it was very important to us that you be able to act on the information and not just read a report. So this is a 30-page playbook where we give out all the detailed results that we've talked about, and we show you where you are. And for those of you who've taken the study, you'll see that the questions are very good, better, best. There's a natural progression in how the answers are phrased, or the questions are phrased, so that you can see, oh, this might be the next best thing I should do. And you can also see what your cohort is doing, what other people like you are doing, and see maybe where am I deficient with respect to your cohort. So the commercial part is for anybody that fills out the study, we will create this automatically for you and send it to you once we're completed with the study. So if you do it now, your data won't go in the original study, but we'll still continue to collect it, and then the next study will get all of you included. So please go to mimo.mit.edu and fill it out. It takes half hour, 45 minutes if you know the answers, longer if you don't. So we would love to see a lot of you fill that out and take advantage of the playbook and really use it to help transform your operations. Thank you. Questions? I see we have Dan here. So should we take questions, or are we ready to go with wrap it up? All right.
Great.
Thank you all very much.